is true, right? On the one hand, news people become celebrities. On the other hand, news is shaped by, if not anonymous people, then average people who are not. So in some cases they're anonymous, going back to your blogger debate, but in some cases they're simply people we've never heard of before, right? People who are using their names, but who are not seen as authorities in a traditional sense. But they probably are as expert as anyone about what happened to them, right? That if we think about it from another level, if you're a protester in the street and the police shoot and kill your friend, then you have knowledge that you are expert on, that in the past the journalist would act as a filter and pass some of that information along and introduce more distortion in the communication. And at that point, they have the ability to directly communicate with the world what happened to them. But we have to read it as subjective, right? We have to realize that they're now embedded in that situation and that they are experiencing things from a particular point of view. And they're not capable of telling us the whole truth of what went on. But they are able to tell us the part they know more accurately, probably, and more immediately than filtered through a traditional journalistic chain of information flow.
Get out this new and comes another, because this is the news. Everybody wants to know about this. In that case, people have some power about even the channels.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm saying, is that I think that's a reality, that news is going to come bottom up. The demand for news will be more articulate in a world where people have other channels of information. And it may be they have channels of information they don't fully trust, but they're seeking out someone they do trust, i.e. the professional journalist, to do some of the work of digging out and finding out what's true or what's false. So that's part of the expectation they're bringing. It's not that they are saying the bloggers are right and the journalists are wrong. They may be saying, I'm hearing this in one place and I'm not hearing it in the other. And that creates curiosity or desire to get a different picture. That is, and if that's the case, and the journalist isn't reporting and correcting some of the information that's out there, the journalist probably isn't doing their job in relation to the citizens of the community that they're serving. On the other hand, if we only got the news we want to read, we are impoverished by that. That part of what journalists do is insist that we pay attention to the things that we might not know we cared about, or that we might not know was important for us to care about. So this was my critique a decade ago, that the theory was we were going to have the daily me. And all I have to do is set a filter on my computer and it will bring to me the information I need based on who I am and what I'm interested in. Right? And it can bring it from any newspaper on the web, will bring that information together to give me the perfect newspaper. And it's the daily me, it's exactly what I want. But then we would live in a Tower of Babel society where each of us knows only what we know going in we want to know. And the other things that we should know about that journalists traditionally, investigative reporters, suddenly say, water is really important to pay attention to right now. You know, water wasn't on your filter, but you still want to pay attention to it because you could die from,
If a citizen journalist is going to make money putting things on YouTube, which has a bunch of views, and we're not talking about blogs and writing things. I'm not a writing journalist.
Yeah.
So you think this is going to change for the future?
I think we're seeing as platforms like YouTube are more and more under pressure to share advertising revenue with the content creators. I don't know how this is going to play itself out, but we can imagine a structure where if I put content on YouTube and it draws a certain number of eyes to YouTube and people see the ads on YouTube, that I should benefit from that, right? And that structure would create a micro-payment structure that gave feed money to content creators, including journalists, who created stuff that's traveled on the web. That would be one way of doing it.
But YouTube is just stopping because there are many people, as any people in a mobile phone, take a video and put it on YouTube. They can control it, they're not paying for that. But Vimeo or any other video sites, it's just put on something on the side to make profit to, paying
Yeah.
for their people's professional rights.
And I think this is the transitional moment where there's a lot of criticism of the Web 2.0 model, that YouTube or Vimeo or any of these sites have, that it sounds like on paper that it's a place that creates great opportunities for amateurs and independent creators to create and share media. Reality is it can also be a form of economic exploitation where they make all the money and we make all the content. And there's a lot of debate about what's going to be a fair system. How do we create a system where there's compensation for content creators in that environment? And you certainly don't want a system where your content gets taken away from you and you make no revenue off of it, and you're starving, and even as you're at the peak of your success. And I think that's a challenge we need to look at right now. How to build a structure where there is financial support for people who produce content that succeeds. That said, the reality is we're also at a moment when we gain power and influence by circulation. And the new book, Spreadable Media, is very much about how circulation changes things for artists. The example I often use is Cory Doctorow, who's a science fiction writer. And his line is that more artists suffer from obscurity than piracy. That for him, the important thing is getting his content out and getting people seeing it.
And you can also manage which content you want to show.
Exactly.
So you can do that.
So Cory has published all of his books freely on the web in Creative Commons license with attribution. And he sells his books. And the interesting thing is the more he gives away free content, he says, the more his books sell, because people know about his books. He doesn't sell one for one. There's a lot of people read the book for free and don't buy the content. But no one buys the content who doesn't know about the book to begin with. And an awful lot of people who read the book online say, I really like a hard copy so I can read it in the bathtub, or I can keep it on my bookshelf, or I can give it to a friend as a gift. And lo and behold, a percentage of the people who read his content for free are buying it, and it's a much higher percentage who are buying it than were buying it before he gave away the content for free. And journalists are starting to see that as a model too. It's harder to get there because, what's the hard copy of journalism? But I think it is a way of building visibility that supports the next phase of your career and may pave the way for those book contracts you're talking about, or some of the other things. It may be harder for journalists than prostitutes to get those book contracts, but nevertheless, you work hard in either profession, you probably can get your contract. The idea of undead corporations, heartless corporations, lots of ways in which the zombie metaphor worked, but it existed alongside a number of other metaphors for talking about wealth that different protesters staged in different contexts and created video around, images around, and put them into circulation. So how this works as a civic ecology is best illustrated, I think, by this guy, the pepper spray cop. And this was a campus policeman at UC Davis, University of California, Davis, who pepper sprayed a group of protesters who were sitting peacefully on the ground. He just walked up and sprayed them in the face with pepper spray, and the cameras caught it. Right, and it got a limited amount of news media the day that it occurred. It occurred on a Saturday. And it's a sort of story, it happened on a university campus. You picture the university paper covering it. Maybe the city paper covers it. But it's one snapshot of many among the national issues that are on Occupy. But what happened over the weekend is by Monday morning, the news media was reporting more than 200 mashups that people had taken the image of the pepper spray cop and inserted it into a variety of contexts. And you see there famous paintings, political paintings, paintings of people peacefully gathered. You see Ben-Hur, the movie. These are just 4 out of 200, 300 that were created during that time period that circulated. And no one saw all of those mashups unless you went to some site like Know Your Memes that cataloged them all. But many people saw some of them. And the result was to take this photograph taken by a photojournalist and turn it into an icon of the Occupy movement, so that people all over the country, and I find talking in Europe, lots of people in Europe know of this story as well, that this has become a symbol of a political movement that exists at the intersection between traditional photojournalism and remix culture that shapes the way we make sense of this event. I think of these mashups as the people's editorial cartoon. So part of what an editorial cartoon does is it encapsulates a set of issues in some sort of iconic image that people can read and remember, that becomes a memorable image. And the best editorial cartoons last decades, right? People remember the historical events through them. But rather than being produced by the newspaper, these editorial cartoons are produced by anyone who's got access to Photoshop, right? And the capacity to put it into circulation. So these are not doing the news function of journalism, but they are doing the editorial cartoon function of the traditional newspaper and exploding it outward so that instantaneously many people are creating bids for meaning. They're creating different versions of these events and generating awareness around them. And I think this is part of what I mean by civic ecology as well. It's a different function than the reporting function, but it's very much a civic ecology. The game designer Will Wright, who did The Sims and Spore, had this quote about games that I think are interesting, but if we apply it to journalism. So this is talking about games, but think about it as a newspaper instead of a game. He says, all of these different games / newspapers are competing for communities, which in the long run are what drive our sales. Whichever game attracts the best community will enjoy the most success. What you can do to make the game more successful is not to make the game better, but to make the community better. And what he's saying is that in The Sims, people took The Sims and built all kinds of content. What you see here is the mall of The Sims, where people designed furniture and costumes and fashion and all kinds of stuff, and created shops and sold content to other gamers who could download it and put it into their game. And so what Will Wright said ultimately was that about 40% of the content of The Sims came from the game designers, and about 60% came from the community of gamers around the game. So what if we said what allows newspapers to survive is the ability to generate the most active and creative communities? And newspapers measure their success by what they allow or support the community in doing in relation to the newspaper. Imagine that proportion, that 40% of the news was generated by the professional and 60% by the community. What newspapers would look radically different than they look today. But they might be newspapers that were more deeply rooted in the lives of the communities they were covering than the newspapers we've inherited from the previous generation. So I'm not advocating getting rid of 60% of the journalists. I'm simply saying think of expanding the capacity of the newspaper by 60%, right? By opening up a space for the public to play a more active role around the construction of news. So the Knight Foundation, which has really spent a lot of its money and time in recent years in the United States focusing on the future of journalism, did this report called Informing Communities, Sustaining Democracy in the Digital Age, that takes a lot of my assumptions, or makes some of the same assumptions I'm making here. And they said the three challenges that communities face, and they're not just talking about journalists, they're talking about the civic ecology, all the things that might contribute to solving the needs of the communities. So one is maximize the availability of relevant and credible information to all Americans in their communities. That's their framing. It applies probably to other countries as well, but that's the way they framed it. Strengthen the capacity of individuals to engage with information and promote individual engagement with information in the public life of the community. And I'm going to break these down carefully and talk through each of them. But this is a picture they're giving of how do we strengthen the civic ecology. And they did it agnostically, even though Knight was a newspaper chain and they're deeply invested in the news. They said, let's not focus on the newspaper, let's focus on the information needs of communities and then figure out what do we need to do to strengthen that. So the first is to maximize the availability of relevant and credible information. So how do we expand the information resources? But the key word there is credible, right? Because that's what we were talking about before the break, to ensure the credibility and reliability of that information as we're diversifying the kinds of information sources we have access to. we could think of this in terms of a global civic ecology, right? This goes back to what we were talking about borders before. You know, that this information environment is now global. We still tend to read mostly information produced in our own culture, in our own country, but we have access to a broader range of it. So Global Voices is a website where bloggers around the world are translated into new other languages, and it plays a gatekeeping function of identifying the best bloggers, the most interesting bloggers around key issues, and making that stuff more widely available across language groups. Witness is a political organization, human rights organization that allows people to trade videos of atrocities, torture, abuse through its portal, and calls attention to human rights violations taking place around the world, empowering independent media makers to capture their own experience and share it with the world. And it was started in the wake of the Rodney King video and the LA riots, where the Rodney King video that showed a policeman abusing a black suspect had sparked enormous political debate in the United States, and they wanted to create an ongoing space, an organization that supported that around the world. Crunchyroll is a space that trades animated videos from basically Japan and Eastern Asia to Europe and America. It's not in the news business at all, but it suggests to me something interesting, which is that young people are consuming popular culture outside of their national culture. That many people in America now are consuming, young people consume anime, they consume Bollywood from India, they may be consuming Latin American telenovelas, much of the media they're consuming comes from other parts of the world, and they see consuming that media as a way of connecting with other cultures, that it's a drive toward what I call pop cosmopolitanism. This is occurring at the same time where the American press keeps saying that people are not interested in foreign news. And I think that's a really interesting sign of the moment. And I would argue it's in part because American press still conceives of it as foreign news rather than as global news. Because foreign news keeps it over there. So, you know, the story about Portugal is treated as if it had no impact on the United States, as if it was self-contained within Portugal, rather than saying when I lived in Boston, there was a significant Portuguese population of Boston, right? Portuguese immigrants, large numbers there, had moved there to participate in the fishing trade in Boston. To treat stories of Portugal as foreign news in the Boston Globe rather than as something that connects to the lives of all the Portuguese-speaking people who live in that city seems like a very strange way to think, and not the way these other sites are thinking. If they're trying to connect people together across national borders, not to treat them as if these could be compartmentalized, separated out. And so part of what we're going to take advantage of global civic ecology is to get rid of the old gentlemen's foreign affairs clubs that have traditionally shaped foreign coverage, and instead to sort of think of it as something that's integrated into the lives of people who live in a communication environment that is much more porous than previous environments have been. The lives of people are connected through information exchanges in a very different way than before. This is not to say the world is flat. It's not to say that everyone has equality of access to information. It is to say we're moving in a direction where there's more porousness of communication than we saw in previous generation. And that we have to factor that in as we think about what news coverage looks like or how news coverage positions itself. So I would say all three of these are ways that people are using the web to learn about the world in a much broader sense than the foreign correspondence reports in the newspaper might look like. As this happens, then we're seeing communication that takes place through both high-tech and low-tech means. That as we think about the information environment, we shouldn't displace very traditional kinds of communication. This audio cassette tape here represents a system in Africa where people have been creating soap operas that contain health information, particularly sex health information, and putting them on tapes that truck drivers driving across the country listen to on their long drives. And so the audio cassette goes in the audio player on the truck. The truck driver's got a long drive. He's listening to soaps as he drives across the country. He gets to a truck stop, trades one tape in, gets another tape. But in it is embedded in the entertainment a lot of basic information he needs to have about reproductive rights, about sexual diseases, about a number of things that has been embedded in it. This is a model called entertainment education that's very successful. But what interested me was the use of the audio cassette, not the internet, as the means by which that information gets out. The poster here, the graffiti, is from one of the recent struggles in Lebanon. One of my Lebanese American students called attention to the fact that cartoonists in Lebanon were creating cartoons, had them scanned on the internet. They were printed out in other cities around the world where there are Lebanese population, and then the cartoons were stenciled, painted onto lampposts as a way of getting those images and information out to the people there who might not have digital access, might not be able to read even, or read in the language, but could start to put together something of what was taking place at home. It was a way of spreading news that combined high-tech and low-tech at various points in its trajectory. So again, it goes back to by any means necessary. We're going to think about the magic markers on the hands. My point is that civic ecology will not just be digital, but the digital exists alongside these other communication channels, and knowing that shapes how we think about it. So if the challenge then is about ensuring equality of access, then we face really three different problems, three different divides that I think need to be talked about separately and together. The first is the digital divide. And the digital divide's probably gotten the most discussion in mainstream news media, and that's really access to technology. So who has access to network computers? And that's actually a multi-layered problem, because you can, in the United States they said, we will ensure that everyone has access to computers through schools and public libraries, if not individual computers. And the last numbers I saw, so about 96% of American youth have access to network computing in that way. But then the federal government passed laws that put mandatory filters on those technologies, blocked out certain key websites. YouTube's blocked in schools, Wikipedia's blocked in schools, MySpace and Facebook is blocked in schools. And so at the end of the day, we wire the classroom and disable the computer. Right? So we gain ground and lose ground on the struggle to ensure technical access to the means of communication. The participation gap is access to skills, knowledge, and opportunities, right? So you can have access to a computer and not know what to do with it. You can have access to a computer and not have an understanding of how digital culture operates and how to use it effectively to communicate your interest. And this is true for significant numbers of young people all over the world who have access to computers but don't know how to use it in a way that's meaningful, that's rewarding, don't know how to use it to really access information that's going to be an important part of their life. And so that means as we solve the digital divide, then we have to embrace the participation gap, and through schools and through public outreach, give people opportunities to use the affordances of digital media and know how to process information. And for me, ethical education is a crucial part of that, right? That as we expand communication capacity, teaching people to think about their role as media producers and circulators, that take ownership over the information they circulate, is a fundamental part of that struggle. And then beyond that is what people are calling the civic empowerment gap, which is to say, you have access to a computer, you know how to use the computer, but you don't know how to use the computer as a citizen. You don't feel empowered to participate in the core discussions of democracy. And for many, many young people, the political process has locked them out. The language of politics doesn't speak to them. The language of news doesn't communicate. That you have to know an awful lot about politics to read the average news story about politics and understand what's going on. That despite the idea of every story being self-contained, reality is it's not. That the language of politics is highly exclusionary, and the news coverage of politics doesn't generally invite our participation. It invites us to be spectators rather than participants in the news. And so these are the three layers of a problem that we have to work through before we're at the point where citizens are able to fully participate, or where we have the diversity of voices that is the potential of a network society, but that in practice isn't where we're at yet. That more people are speaking than before. We live in a more participatory culture, but we don't yet live in a culture where everyone gets to participate. And I think that's part of the challenge that we're looking at. My mentor, John Fisk, said in one of his books that in the Middle Ages, everyone had a larynx, but not everyone was allowed to speak. And so that I take as a really great comment on the digital divide, that having access to the technology is not sufficient if you don't have these other things I'm describing about skills, knowledge, a sense of civic empowerment to be part of the process. So challenge 2 is to strengthen the capacity to engage with information. And that's part of what I'm just describing. What do we need to do in order for people to use information rationally and accountably? And I moved from the picture of the newspaper here to the teacher, because the teacher plays a crucial role in shaping our ability to engage with information. But I also think the press can play that role when it takes on some of the teaching functions for a society. And I think there's an urgency about the press taking on those functions as more and more people are dealing with a communication environment they don't fully and completely understand. So for the MacArthur Foundation, I wrote a white paper that tried to identify what are the new media literacies, the skills that are needed to fully participate in the culture of the present moment, to become fully a contributor. And I'm talking about as a citizen, as a worker, or as a creative individual. And I'm not going to go through all of these skills here, but this is the list of the skills that we identified, and we've set out to develop resources to help teachers in the United States acquire some of these skills or know how to integrate some of these skills into their teaching. And this is part of a larger American initiative called the Digital Media and Learning Initiative that's funded by the MacArthur Foundation. It's really focusing a lot of attention on education to get kids the skills they need to participate in those processes.
What about performance?
Yeah, performance, we're interested in performance. We define as the ability to take on multiple roles and analyze the world from that perspective. So we're not just talking about acting, but we're talking about a mode of analysis where you are empathetic, where you're imagining the other person's point of view, where you're learning to communicate from multiple frames of reference. And so similarly, play for us is not just about having fun, but a way of experimenting with your environment in a low-risk manner, trying things out, testing things, exploring, experimenting in certain ways. And now play turns out for American teachers to be the skill that they are most drawn toward of the 12 that we've identified. They know it's something that's lost from American schools and something that they know the value of. And so we're exploring how do we create a more playful environment where people can take risk and test out possibilities without it coming back and having consequences, because our schools are in a regime of high stakes standardized testing that affects young people's lives. As many European countries have long had these exams, America's moved in that direction as well, and people are afraid it's squeezing out arts education and music education and all of the things that are expressive, that are experimental, that are creative, get crushed. And then we start to see the results of loss of creativity is something people are diagnosing in the society, despite many, many opportunities for creativity out of school.
You did put performance before play.
In this version, it's sort of these end up in different orders or different lists. It's sort of there's nothing particularly significant about it, but it is an important skill and one that I think is designed to encourage both understanding across differences and to understand yourself better by those kinds of performance processes. So part of it is about creating, allowing creativity that takes place outside of school to enter into the school. And that's particularly important because of those inequalities of access I just talked about, those various gaps. And if school is the great equalizer where people have access to knowledge and skills, then the school, which is the way the Americans have long thought about education as a tool of democracy, then the school needs to factor in the creative and civic opportunities that people enjoy outside of school in a much more robust way. And so for us, we're doing after-school programs, we're doing teacher training programs. We're developing online resources for teachers, try to help them integrate some of these skills and experiences into their teaching. And then also acting as an advocacy against some of the mandatory filters that have sort of blocked schools from being able to use some of the key programs of the digital era, which is a big battle. Many people are more concerned about safety, protecting kids from being exposed to things in school, than they are about education in this context. And my sense is that kids are not safer if they have to face these things on their own outside of school. That they're safer if teachers and librarians who are trained about the ethical and safe use of these technologies integrate them into their teaching and help kids learn more about them, rather than pretending they don't exist, locking the schoolhouse doors and saying, you go deal with it on your own. So the arguments of child safety that underlie a lot of the filtering, I think, could be flipped and say that kids are in fact much less safe if the stuff isn't integrated in the schools and they're not modeled good ways of using these technologies. And certainly the ethical issues that some of you are talking about are best served in a context where we can really talk through the use of these technologies and where we can provide a structure of mentorship around the use of technologies, rather than one where kids are left to deal with them on their own. I use the example of student journalism programs where students have long been mentored into how to do journalism through high school programs, high school newspapers. But then kids are absolutely free to write anything they want on the internet without any adult advice or support. And research is showing most young people don't have a mentor, an adult mentor who they can turn to about issues they face in their digital lives. So even those kids who have a lot of exposure outside of school may not be able to go beyond, they may solve the digital divide but not advance to those other layers because they don't have adults who are guiding them. And I think it's much more important for us to have librarians and teachers who are trained to help support that than it is to block out everything and make the school a digital-free zone, which ensures with the worst-case scenario for everyone in that regard. So part of what we've talked about before the break was what I would call here competing regimes of truth. That is, different statements being put in the circulation from different points of view that make it really hard to sort out the truth. And this is a cartoon that sort of makes fun of the various theories about who Obama is that sort of circulate on the web. And they really reflect different, if you bought into those theories, if you believed that Obama was secretly a Muslim, then you read everything about his activities as president differently than if you believe that's total nonsense. That if you, and these interpretive frames then affect how we process the news, what information we seek out, and so forth. And so knowing that and confronting that ought to be the first step of creating a more reliable news environment, giving people skills to sort through these things. And I think that's part of the challenge. Challenge 3 is to promote engagement. So go beyond teaching critical skills to teaching how do people participate, how do they become part of the civic process. And I have to say, I intentionally created somewhat campy, overly American images of these processes going back to Norman Rockwell just to sort of dramatize what's at stake here. But Rockwell captured all of this in his artworks in the 1930s that were part of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, his presentation of the New Deal. And there's still values today that I think we care about in one way or another. So this white paper, Public Media 2.0, Dynamic Engaged Publics, which was issued by the Center for Social Media, sort of challenges the idea of public service media in favor of public facilitating media. So the idea, Americans talk about public media as media that services the public's needs. And that's a very paternalistic, very centralized, top-down model, right? That it often means that some group of journalists thinks they know what the public needs and gives the public what it needs rather than what it wants, so forth. She says, what if we thought of it as media that creates and mobilizes publics? That is the public as in the public sphere, a la Habermas, the group that gathers together to form opinion and debate issues. What if the job of the journalist was to facilitate publics, to bring publics together around core issues, to give them the resources they need to mobilize and to make change at the level of their own communities, not just passively feed them information, but to actively create a shared space where those informations can be discussed, where different members of the public are brought together for dialogue and so forth. And so something like the museum in Washington, D.C. does some of those kinds of functions to create public occasions, to create public discussions, but also online communities that are created around publics. Retool newspapers to do outreach to specific segments of the population that have been left behind and have not fully been able to participate in public conversations. Become an important part of building an information structure that supports the needs of publics, and publics understood now in a much more active, dynamic, networked, connected sense, rather than the individual news consumer, which is sort of at the heart of the old public service media model, is part of what this white paper is advocating. And they have lots and lots of great examples that they use of different experiments in journalism that do some of that. And when time allows, I'll share you a couple of videos of projects at USC that are starting to try to do some of this stuff. Robert Greenwald is a progressive documentary filmmaker in the United States who has done films. One of his films is called Outfoxed, which is a critique of Fox News. He's done stuff on the Iraq War. And he quickly discovered, first he discovered Netflix and video exhibition as a way of getting his documentaries out. But he makes sure that the films are available there, and he creates a structure around them where people have house parties, where they gather in people's homes, they watch the videos together, there's tools and resources he gives them to lead discussions, and the goal is not just to watch his films, but to discuss his films. And more recently, he's moved to using social media, to even as he's making the films, to send out 5-minute sequences via social media almost every day, and to create online forums to have discussions, as well as the home-based discussions he generates. But his model is that of creating publics, creating spaces of discussion where communities gather to talk about the documentaries that he's produced. And his come with a very specific political point of view. They're not news, but they are ways of talking about current events. And this brings us to CUNY 2012, which I think had a similar model, that is, Invisible Children had spent, I can't remember what my slides are here. Okay, spent about 8 years building a base of hundreds of thousands of citizens who were aware of their concerns about Africa, mostly student groups at high schools and colleges, but also church-based groups that were committed to being engaged in their campaigns and who have done stuff in the streets, right? These are not people who just tweeted about things or didn't just read Facebook. These are people who were involved in various political rallies and so forth. He built that capacity up, and then he released this video. And he saw this video as the first of a series of communications. The organization saw this as the first of a series of communications with their supporters to launch a campaign. Now the video went, as they would say, went viral, and it spread incredibly far, incredibly fast. And just to put it in perspective, this is a chart that shows how many days it took to reach 70 million views. And it includes some of the sort of viral videos, the silly videos that people know. Charlie Bit My Finger, David After the Dentist, Dramatic Gopher. I don't know which of these, the wedding dance, the sneezing panda. I mean, I don't know which of these you know here, but a lot of these spread all over the world really, really fast. And then we get to the Old Spice campaign, which is probably the most successful brand to use YouTube. And we get to Susan Boyle, the video from Britain's Got Talent that sort of spread globally. And then in 4 days, CUNY 2012 reached 70 million views. Put that into perspective, the highest rated show on American television gets about 40 million viewers. And about 40 million viewers, the highest rated shows on American television. And the box office success that week when the video launched was Hunger Games, which broke the records for the box office in the US up until The Avengers this past weekend. Hunger Games attracted about 15 million viewers that weekend. So this video by a non-profit organization, 30-minute documentary about human rights in Uganda, saw more viewers in that time period than came to the theaters to see Hunger Games or turned in their TV set to see the highest rated show on American television. That's extraordinary grassroots power to shape the public conversation. So whatever we think of the video and what its perspective, and was it too simplistic or not, just the capacity to be seen and to change the conversation is a really powerful example of how people are mobilizing and engaging with media content. So this is a chart, this is a map of Twitter flows, Twitter traffics that was done by the Social Flow group. It tells us something about how this video traveled and how people engaged with it. And we see the bigger the word is, the more people were involved in that cluster of activity. So the largest, the densest cluster is around invisible children, the organization itself, and that makes sense, that this is the central hub the information flows from. The filmmaker Jason Russell, who created the video, also looms fairly large there. Kristen Bell is one of 100 celebrities they targeted with the campaign, and part of their model of the campaign was to get people pushing their favorite celebrities to come out in support of the agenda. And so there was the celebrities were pushed by their fans to take a stand. Kristen Bell was one of the first to take a stand about it. She's an actress on a television show, Veronica Mars. She's not a minor celebrity, but she was quick to act, and so she had an actually large impact on this flow. But the interesting thing is, if we look at the big dense clusters around the edges here, these are from middle-sized, middle American cities. Dayton, Ohio, Birmingham, Alabama, Oklahoma City, Pittsburgh. These are not New York, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles where the center of the traffic came from. This was a case where people in small towns connected with this video, not small towns, but middle-sized cities connected with this video and started to circulate it. And their influence shaped the national conversation in this instance. And those are where the invisible children had the greatest impact in terms of recruiting members in the past. So this is sort of what we would expect to see, but it's not what you expect to see in the traditional news model where, you know, in the United States, news flows from New York, D.C., and Los Angeles out to the population. So these are just some of the political rallies they've done with large numbers of people involved. These are some of the earlier films that they made. This is an interesting document of it as well. These are key words from the tweets that circulated the video. So what we see here, several things that are interesting. One is how prevalent Christian messages were in the circulation of the video. The Invisible Children as an organization does not have an overtly religious message, but it has worked closely with churches as well as schools. And in the American context, because of that, if it wants to work in the schools, it can't have an overtly religious message because of the separation of church and state. So it has a soft religious message. It works with churches, but when we see the snapshot of who spread this, we can see the impact of their outreach to churches on the one hand, with words like God, Jesus, but also life and love probably come with a Christian frame in the American context. But we also see university, student, sports, music, fan, which probably suggests a student population, right? And those are two very different groups with very different agendas who are spreading this message. And so we see here, we can see those groups. We also see this message spreads. It's spread by a variety of other people on a local level who have their own agendas for circulating this message. And we take the Invisible Children CUNY 2012 out of this, put a news article into it. Then words will be different here. But the idea of diverse publics mobilizing and moving the message through the culture would remain the same. So we have to move away from thinking of lowest common denominator, speak one message to the public, and think of the degree to which multiple publics will take up your message and move it across the culture on their own, through their own circuits, for their own purposes. But this is how news will circulate for the foreseeable future. It will look more like Invisible Children than like a broadcast center to periphery model that we're used to seeing. And I think this is a snapshot of the communication environment we're living in now. So I'm going to So let me pause there and open up for some questions. And if time allows, after some of your questions, I'll show you a couple of videos of projects at USC that are trying to we've been working in Los Angeles with the Robert F. Kennedy School, which is a school facility at the site of the Ambassador Hotel. And those of you who know your political history of the United States, Ambassador Hotel is where Robert Kennedy was shot and killed during the California primary in 1968. And the Kennedy family wanted that space not to be a hotel with a plaque in it, but as the hotel was getting up in years and decrepit, they pushed the city to build a living monument there, and so they created a school facility that serves low-income Latino kids from LA who previously had to be bused like an hour a day each direction to schools, and now have a neighborhood school. So we go into the school and we work with in a media laboratory that's actually in the kitchen where Robert Kennedy died. And it's really a very powerful experience to be using that space to educate the future generation of citizens within that community. And we've done digital citizenship kinds of lessons around news literacy and around civic awareness and around the use of new media and help kids to learn how to do that. We've done teacher training program with teachers across Los Angeles to get them to think about how to integrate new media and civic citizenship issues into their teaching. We've developed a toolkit that will allow people to create multimedia lessons and share them with each other, across the country and around the world. So ultimately, we want it to be a tool that's used to connect kids together. So the idea of the Hispanic kids here connecting to, Spanish-speaking peoples of Europe and Latin America, or, Portuguese kids connecting with kids from Brazil. That's part of what we hope can happen. They trade media perspectives with each other, and that becomes a resource for both students and teachers and parents to use in fostering greater media literacy. We're just finishing the platform. We've been testing it with teachers in schools in Los Angeles, and there's a lot of excitement about it. It's going to be another year or so before it fully rolls out. But we hope it will be something that we can recruit educators in many parts of the world to participate in.
It's free of charge?
It will be free of charge, yes. And then the other side is I'm involved in a research network with MacArthur to look at youth and political participation. And this is a network that combines quantitative researchers who are doing a large-scale national survey, particularly targeting minority youth and trying to understand how they're using new media, what ties to their political lives are, and so forth, which is getting some very, very interesting results that show African American youth are far more likely to use new media politically than Caucasian youth are, for example, which is a really interesting finding. But the other thing it found is about 85% of kids identify having more help measuring the credibility of information they see online is a high priority. It's something that they actually are seeking out and not receiving from schools or other institutions in their lives. And that, I think, is going to have some interesting findings. But my team is a qualitative team, and we're doing studies of specifically successful networks and organizations that have been effective at getting kids involved in the political process. And so we're looking at everything from, we've been studying invisible children for about 3 years, which is why the CUNY 2012 thing was particularly interesting to me. We're studying groups like Nerd Fighters and the Harry Potter Alliance, which are fan activist groups. We're studying libertarian youth. We're studying Islamic American young people. We're studying the Dream activists, who are undocumented youth, who are using new media to fight for citizen and education rights in the United States. And we're studying Occupy. And those are our case studies, and we're finding some really interesting trends across them about the centrality of cultural participation to political participation.
Do you publish this online?
We have a blog that's publishing some of that. We're about to release the first of our white papers on the Dream activist case study, which we hope will roll out in the next month. Will be publicly available, and we will be publishing from there. We're just at the point where, after 2.5 years of research, that this stuff will finally be able to be made public and hopefully be part of the conversation, from this point forward. But it's going to be over the next 2 to 3 years. These reports will start coming out and will start to be seen, and hopefully change a little bit the way people think about new media as it relates to politics. So MacArthur has been instrumental on both sides of that. It's been an important partnership for me.
I'd like to hear your opinion.
And I'm an optimist by nature, so 5 out of 7 days I wake up believing that we live in a more democratic society than we did before, that the public is going to have more access to information, is going to weigh in more often, and that will ensure greater accountability of governments to citizens. I'm not sure that happens without a very vigorous professional press, and I think that's an important part of this. We have to have journalists to play that role well. But I'm also quite aware of how deeply partisan the United States politics has become over the same period of time. And some of it is choices by the political leaders to how they respond to 24-hour, 7-day-a-week news cycles. Where it's not just, even if we took the internet away, they would be held under constant referendum, but the referendum would be held by Fox News versus MSNBC versus CNN, that these various newscasters play an incredibly powerful role in questioning every decision and focusing on the short term rather than the long term consequences of decisions, because they've got to have something they can talk about today, now, and they rarely go back and monitor the progress made over the long haul. And so news has become more and more short term in the ways in which we respond to it. But some of it is that information bubble problem of Republicans more and more listening to Republican news about politics, Democrats more and more focusing on Democratic news about politics. But if I just read the Huffington Post as a liberal Democrat online, and my world would be shaped entirely by stuff that's incredible, at war every minute with the Republicans, and every outrageous thing said by a Republican anywhere in the United States is instantly covered in the Huffington Post, right? So I have access to all this information, and it stirs me up. And on a regular basis, I just get angry over and over and over again by that. And unless we build mechanisms that break through that, we've got problems. Now, the good news is that we don't just talk about politics online. We talk about all kinds of other things online. And when we talk about our favorite TV show, we're not identifying as Republicans and Democrats. We're identifying as people who share a certain fantasy. And we can use that fantasy to talk through our shared visions for the future. So the most interesting political discussions take place in non-political websites, right? Websites where we're joined by other axes besides ideology. One of my students did a case study of a website about diamonds, and mostly attracted young couples who were trying to buy their engagement rings and their wedding rings. And they'd go on the site and talk about and learn about diamonds from each other. And they had an off-topic area, which 4 years ago was dominated by the discussion of Obama versus McCain, and in fact had a more diversity of perspectives on it than most news sites or most political sites did. And she found all these quotes where people said, well, I don't really like your politics, but you've got great taste in diamonds. Right? And that suggests a willingness to have a discussion with someone because of shared interest, other than politics, that allowed the political discussion to actually grow and thrive. Now, Robert Putnam wrote this important book, Bowling Alone, that many Americans have read about the civic engagement, and I suspect is known here somewhat. And Putnam's model was the 1950s bowling league as the ideal civic society for America. And the idea of the bowling league is that people got together regularly with their friends and neighbors and they bowled, right? And bowling's not the most thrilling game of all time, because one person's up and bowls and the rest of the people are sitting on the bench waiting for their turn to bowl. But while they're waiting on the bench, they're talking to each other about all kinds of stuff, right? And so the bowling became a way that people gathered publicly on a regular basis to engage in political and civic discussions. So these online forums that are not about news, but news creeps into, may function much more like Putnam's bowling league as a space where people's recreational lives create shared values through which they can talk about things they disagree with, than the political sites and news sites today, which are so divided in the American context. So, to my mind, my fear is we live in a world that's more and more divided, and therefore democracy becomes more and more dysfunctional, right? That democracy rests on us having some shared values and commitments to each other, at least to the infrastructure through which debates are going to take place. But we've got to at least agree on the rules of the debate. We have to accept that legislation passes that that's a resolved issue and that we give time for things to work, whether we agreed with the legislation or not. And the danger is we live in a society where nothing is resolved, everything is up for debate every minute, and the debates are sharply divided, and there's no middle ground and no compromise. And that's the fear I think many of us have of where the United States is right now, unless, and whether digital media contribute is part of the problem or part of the solution depends on how we use digital media.
And how do you think politicians are dealing with this new reality? Because it's also important the way they deal with this. How do you think they are doing that?
Well, they're taking pictures of their wieners and sending them out by Twitter. I mean, I think they're doing a really bad job with it. We've seen plenty of really painfully awkward and stupid uses of this technology by the political leadership, and relatively few good examples of how to use it. And I would have said the Obama campaign 4 years ago was a particularly rich example of this, and he surrounded himself with advisors who theoretically know something about digital democracy, but in the end, he's had a very traditional presidency that hasn't used social media very much or very well. He's made some progress toward transparency online, but he's really not been the innovator that he seemed to be in the campaign. And so we have to then wonder, is that because he changed as he became president, or because there's a lot of institutional resistances to changing the way government spreads information, that social media's values and government's values institutionally are not well aligned. And I know Obama had to fight even to use his BlackBerry when he became president, because there was anxiety about how information flows would work in an American government. So some of it is the individual politicians, right? And someone who was, Anthony Weiner, the New York representative, who sort of had to resign in scandal over sending sexual pictures via Twitter to massive numbers of people, was on one of the committees that regulates the internet in the United States. So it's a very, very scary piece that he confused direct messaging, which allows him to send to one person, with send to all, and sent a very personal and very intimate image to the entire following. Instant exposure, so to speak. And that's the kind of level of comprehension that are held by people who are shaping policy in the United States around digital technology. And I can't imagine it's better here or anywhere else. That I think political leadership are not the generation that understands these technologies very well. They understand them as tools of campaigning, not tools of governance, and not tools of soliciting opinion from their constituencies particularly well.
Of ability, a question of knowledge, or a question of attitude. For example, I remember before all this in '94, the first visible anarchist movement that we have here in Portugal. Nobody remembers them anymore. It was Occupy the Street. So you have this bunch of guys that went to one of our main streets. So I was reporting, and first thing that they told me was, I hate journalists. So I cannot speak with them. You try to explain that it would be important to speak, and they said, no, I don't speak with you because you are establishment reporter. So what I'm asking is, in your data, it's a question of knowledge, or it's a question of attitude? For example, let's think about Black Bloc, underground, clandestine culture. What is going on?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think people are choosing different levels of visibility. So I don't know anything about the specifics of this, so I can't speak to this group. But I think people are choosing, so you can have a media strategy which is focused on communicating with the mainstream media. You could have a media strategy which is focused on getting your message out through grassroots media. Or you can have a media strategy in between. Or you can choose to operate off the grid, right? For whatever reasons, not to be publicly under scrutiny, not to do outreach, and so forth. And different groups are making different choices about how to do that. And I don't think that's even necessarily tied to education or technical capacity. You know, I think it's about what are your goals as an organization, and what do you need public communication for. So I just brought up a couple of slides on the Dream Activist group that we've been studying in the U.S. And these are mostly undocumented immigrants from all over the world. The stereotype is they're from Latin America. A sizable chunk of them are, but they're also from India and Iran and Vietnam and any number of countries of the world that have escaped and crept into the U.S. without visas, without documentation. In many cases, these are the children of those immigrants, right? That they in many cases born here. So that if the idea we send them back to what? They have no citizenship anywhere else either. These are not citizens anywhere on the planet, but they've spent most of their life here. These, by and large, don't have access to a lot of digital technology that they own. We've found bloggers who've been really innovative in their use of blogging technology, but who don't own a computer, that only can use them through schools and public libraries. We've seen photographers who don't have cameras, videographers who don't have video cameras, but have worked collectively to produce stuff, and they are doing incredibly innovative use of new media technology without having ownership of the technology and without having formal training in it. So the most simple thing they're doing is they're going on YouTube and declaring themselves undocumented, right? Which is an incredibly gutsy political move, that they paste the video camera on them and say, I am Jose and I am undocumented. I'm Mohammed and I'm undocumented. And they tell their story. And their goal is to get these videos out to see it in front of as many Americans as they can, who may never have met someone who was undocumented, either because the undocumented tend to live in certain communities and not to be widely have access to the middle class homes, and because many undocumented are hiding and in closet, they don't even know each other. But that act of going out and telling their story through social media and getting it into circulation is the first step. And in some cases, these people have been deported based on the videos, that having declared themselves undocumented online holds them exposed to immigration authorities to round them up and throw them out of the country. And they've continued to tweet as they've been put on planes and shipped out of the U.S. Right? So it's not going secretly into the night. It's, you're going to throw me out of the country, I'm going to be a known figure, and I'm going to make this as public as I can. Because they're trying to call attention to the fact that the Obama administration has deported more people than the Bush administration did, and half the time now. That there is a war on immigrants in the U.S., and they're trying to call people out on that. But what they did beyond that is they've used live streaming to take their events wherever they're occurring and throw them out on the web. And part of what's happened is the debate about the DREAM Act has shifted from a federal issue to a state issue. So they couldn't pass it through the U.S. Senate. There are struggles state by state. And some states have passed it, but that means that the movement suddenly becomes fragmented. And so the ability to share information within the movement across the U.S. and across immigrant groups, right? So historically, immigrant politics was divided by ethnicity, even by nationality. So the Mexicans and the Peruvians don't necessarily work well together about immigrant politics. Now these kids are unifying across ethnic groups and across the country and using social media to remain in contact with each other. And the latest thing, which I have very, very mixed feelings about, is they're connecting live webcams to their bodies and going into immigration headquarters and declaring themselves undocumented and taping as long as the authorities will let them what's happening. So people are watching online, people, an act of civil disobedience, and having them be arrested on camera, live. So this is a very different way of engaging in the politics of immigration, which is dependent on secrecy, on isolation, on people not being able to speak and being afraid to speak. And here they're using new media. But again, they're not the wealthy, they're not the ones who necessarily have a lot of technology, they're not the ones who have a lot of skills. They've made a decision to use it to connect each other and tell their story through it. But they're not, by and large, going through mainstream media, right? This is not something news journalists are necessarily covering in the United States, but students, I'm finding when I talk to schools, know about it through social media. Their parents' generation would be delivering their messages not through necessarily journalists, because journalists haven't really responded and respected very well the immigrant community, but through talk radio hosts and DJs on Spanish language radio stations. Historically would have been their outlet, but this group is using social media, disrupting the hierarchy of the immigrant rights movement in order to create different kinds of political affiliations, and doing it in a way that gets messages out not only within their own community, but beyond it, but through YouTube, through Twitter, through my Facebook, through live stream, through a variety of technologies.
Who is their target? Who is their community?
Well, it's a variety of different communities, but not a narrowly defined one. I think it's reaching young people particularly, and the DREAM Act has become something that lots of American youth who are not immigrants are really committed to and really pushing for. And it's becoming a dividing line generationally between, say, Mitt Romney has come out very strongly against the DREAM Act, is very strongly hostile to the idea of making an easy path for citizenship for immigrants, and has largely they should leave the country and apply to come back in. And Obama has been fighting fairly hard for the DREAM Act, but hasn't succeeded in getting it passed. But while he's fighting for the DREAM Act, he's also deporting large numbers of people. But the message is getting through to the young people, particularly through these social media-based.
They're sharing the prejudice by showing their faces and themselves to other kids. They're putting a face on the ugly immigrant, and all of a sudden they're just regular guys and people having fun. It's a great idea. On the long term, it will influence the kids, the future politicians.
Yeah, and what you see is they often use iconography to demonstrate the fit within the society. So this guy's shirt says "Yo, Adrian," which is a line from Rocky, Sylvester Stallone's line. The one that I use often in teaching has a poster from The Office, a sitcom, on the background. So they connect themselves to American popular culture and tell their story in a pretty unvarnished way. I mean, the lighting's not great, it's not technically the most polished thing, but really, really powerful. There's a story that I've shown of, I think it's called My Name is Muhammad and I'm Undocumented. You may be able to find on YouTube. And Muhammad's story is getting accepted to a college, sitting in the office with his acceptance letter and talking about his parents coming from Iran and their hopes for him and so forth. And while he's there, the guy starting looking up and promising his financial aid and so forth because he's a great student. And he looks up and realizes that he checked the undocumented box on the form. And the guy says, "We can't accept you." So he had to take the acceptance letter away from this kid who was sitting there eagerly waiting to go to college, and he said, "You can't come to our university because you're undocumented." And this guy just tells the story in a direct way to the camera, and as I show it to audience, people are in tears watching this guy tell his story. And I've shown it to very conservative groups, on very conservative campuses, and who would their knee-jerk response is, "We should just throw them all out." But when they hear the story, it touches their hearts in a very powerful way. And it's a very effective strategy for getting. And so no one of these videos gets the level of visibility of CUNY 2012. They get hundreds of views, not millions of views, but there's so many of them traveling that different people are stumbling onto and watching. And they're traveling through gamer communities and fan communities and so forth, that people are just encountering these things. And it has some impact, I think, on the way that they see this segment of the population that it's been unseen for so long.
And I think in the beginning, one of the fears was that virtual reality was not that human, but now we see that it's probably more human than the real world.
Yes, because there may be people we encounter in the virtual space that we would not encounter in our everyday space, and they may be easier to permeate boundaries there than it would be.
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting flip.
So I can't speak to why your group, going back to your original question, chooses this particular strategy, but I think obstacles like technological access or education are probably don't determine it absolutely. This group would, by those criteria, be one of the most disadvantaged groups, but they have been one of the most ingenious groups in terms of using social media to get out their message. So I have to assume it's a conscious choice, but I don't know enough to know what's behind that choice.
Sharing the view, but sharing it without even questioning, without being critical, just sharing. Is that enough?
No, I mean, hopefully, ultimately, it's not enough. This is the cartoon. This is an icon that sort of talks
like
about.
Rebel 2.0. Okay. I watched the video. I shared it. Yeah, I've done something.
You've done something,
so proud
and
of me.
there's critiques that's sort of become self-defeating in a way. If all you do is spread the information, and you feel that spreading information is the same thing as acting, then that's probably not the case. But, and this is sort of looks cut off on the slide here, but this is some data from a study done by Georgetown University about people who do what they call promotional social activity, basically spreading videos, passing along tweets, and so forth. And it shows that it's not full political engagement, but it's an important first step toward political engagement. So that they're about as likely as non-social media promoters to donate money themselves. They're twice as likely to volunteer their time, twice as likely to take part in events like charity walks and so forth, more than twice as likely to buy products or services from companies that support their cause, and 3 times as likely to solicit donations. So in other words, this is a stepping stone. That it's not that that not everyone who passes the video along becomes a hardcore activist, and Invisible Children put a lot of time and energy into training a whole generation of student activists through their clubs that are much further along this continuum than the people who simply passed the video along. But passing the video along makes you more likely to do some of these subsequent steps. It's a step toward civic engagement. Then it becomes a qualitative question. When does it become civic engagement? How do we decide, as it is? Would we count writing a letter to the editor of a newspaper as civic engagement? Would we count signing a petition as civic engagement? Probably yes, in which case those equivalent activities as conducted digitally should count as well by that criteria. But we don't know, it's civic it's a civic act, it's not yet civic engagement insofar it's not part of a habit or pattern of behavior. And so for me to be civic, I don't know, Brazil, I'm interested in, because I'm spending more time in Brazil lately. I've been flying to Rio twice a year last 3 years and engaging conversations there. So one of my curiosities here in Portugal has been to try to understand the connections between the Portuguese language speaking countries of the world, and what does and doesn't flow between Portugal and Brazil is something that I'm still trying to get a handle. But it interests me very much because I see Brazil as a really thriving media culture right now. Not just the production of music, which it historically has done, but Globo's productions of telenovelas that are exported, across the region, and I'm told had some impact here at some moment in time. The film industry in Brazil, particularly in Rio, has been growing in significance, and the press is growing in some significance in Rio right now. To the point that about 40% of my readers, my readers are Brazilian at this point. And 40% of the Twitter followers I get, I have 24,000 followers on Twitter, and about 40% of those are Brazilian. And who's the largest selling copy of Convergence Culture outside of English was in Portuguese, but Brazilian Portuguese. So I know that they're engaging with my work, and I tend to see the world in part through their eyes. And I think they're coming with the upcoming of the World Cup and the Olympics, are going to have enormous amount of attention focused on them that will impact the way Portuguese-speaking people are seen in the world. But I don't know what connections exist between a mother country and its former colony, and in terms of communication. But if they will test how far Portuguese language content can travel to the rest of the world, because they're out front pushing that. And obviously they're disadvantaged compared to Spanish in terms of the number of people who speak the language, or in terms of English. But in a world where people are fan-subbing content, which they really want to see, compelling content does break through national borders in some cases. And geography doesn't play the same role now in terms of patterns of circulation as it historically has played. So Brazil may be one of the winners of the digital revolution when everything is set.
But I mean a way of the social medias all over for the big nations, including what the United States see as you. How you see if this is going to develop to help communities, or any other work like the Connie, like Africa, it's helping Africa, or if Brazil is growing, it doesn't matter. Just saying Africa needs growing, and the journalism and other countries needs.
And I think something,
including Portugal.
So. I think, I don't think we're at a point where all of those systems are equally working, at the moment. I think Global Voices is trying to get Americans and pay more attention to Africa by translating African bloggers and supporting African bloggers, and it's a great project. But the reality is much of Africa still is not involved in digital media. I was at Google's headquarters in Mountain View, California, a couple of years ago, and they have this chart that interactive chart that in real time shows Google searches on the internet, and each different colors for different language groups. So as you looked at the United States and you looked at Western Europe, it's like a fireworks show. So many different language shooting up, rapidly querying all the time. And you looked at Africa, and it would be one or two lone queries filtering up to the sky. And it was so powerful for me in understanding the digital divide on a national level, to see just the difference in terms of real-time activity using Google and the internet to search for information in Western Europe and the US versus Africa. So we saw with CUNY 2012, Uganda broke through and had some communication. We're seeing that Nigeria's video industry is now one of the largest media producers in the world, and increasingly significant in shipping product outside of Nigeria, not only across Africa, but the cities in the US and in Europe, right? That Nigerian films, so-called Nollywood films, are being seen, maybe not by the dominant populations of those countries, but by ethnic diasporic populations of those countries that are seeking connections. And in the US, there's some signs of African Americans crossing over to watch Nigerian films as seeking common ethnic heritage and so forth. So there are possibilities now for those communication. But yes, there's no question Brazil's got a lot of advantage over Nigeria. Other kinds of groups stepped up, including Reddit, including Wikipedia, including some fan-based organizations that I've studied, and called attention to this issue and educated the public about it through non-traditional channels, places you don't necessarily turn for news, educated people about this piece of legislation. And they moved rapidly and sent emails and letters to Congress and stopped Congress from passing a law. Now, for the American copyright law has always been written by Hollywood, right? Lawrence Lessig calls it the Mickey Mouse Protection Act, because it's written by Walt Disney to ensure, as Lessig puts it, that no one ever does to Walt Disney's content what Disney did to the Brothers Grimm. And that's a great line to describe, the world that we're creating. This is a time where citizens spoke out and stopped Hollywood from rewriting American copyright law. And they did it not because they were informed by the news. The news coverage came afterwards. There was almost no coverage in the U.S. media of this debate until after it had all played itself out. And then it was news that Wikipedia defeated a piece of legislation, right? That became news, but the legislation itself was not something seen fit to cover. And so I think that was a moment when the American news media was embarrassed by the ways corporate interest had shaped the flow of information, and discovered that they were other groups that would have access to that information and would change the dynamic of what the debate looked like in the United States. The agenda was not, the news was reacting to the agenda of the citizens rather than shaping the agenda of the citizens as it traditionally had been its role. I think we need a system of accountability. Whether it requires naming names is an interesting dilemma, because there are any, just as you have whistleblower sources that journalists talk to off the record to give access to information because they're at risk and proclaiming that information, there are bloggers at risk for talking about things that involve their companies, that involve risky situations and so forth. And so if we created a law that made bloggers identify themselves, those people would be at risk and that information wouldn't circulate. But you need, as a journalist, the ability to have off-the-record sources. And journalists around the world have gone to jail to protect their right to have access to those sources. In a blogging environment, you also want to have the opportunity for those voices to speak directly to the public without going through a journalist, but to also protect themselves from some of the risks that they're going on. But I think, and that's the tension, I think, in the system. We want that. We don't want people just masking their identity, for no good reason and doing malicious things and not being held accountable for it. And so I don't know that there's a good solution that balances those two things out, right? That I see that some of the malicious conspiracy stuff that goes on as really damaging. Although what's been damaging in the case of the rumors about Obama is the refusal of political leaders to deny them and to sort of say that's ridiculous, right? That at any number of points you've had national figures who perfectly know better saying, oh, that's an interesting question, or that's worthy of debate, or, you know, we really should consider that, as a polite response to someone in the audience who's asking them about something they read on a blog, rather than saying, this is wrong, I know this is wrong, and because it's politically advantageous for Republicans to have credibility of Obama damaged on a regular basis by the circulation of these rumors. They haven't seeded them, but they've not shut them down. And I think that, and we more and more are seeing political leaders not taking responsibility for misinformation they throw out. So if you, during the presidential debates in the United States, Sarah Bachman said that Rick Perry's vaccination program led to mental retardation. And when she was called out on it, her response to the journalist was, well, I didn't know if it was true or not, but I thought it was an interesting thing to contribute to the debate. And this is the sort of thing that's happened with this. The miscirculation of information is being used by both journalists and political figures to their own ends at the present time, and that makes it really hard to put a stop to things, because every time a political figure does that, it adds credibility to these conspiracy theories. The blogger has to work with an established organization which has that level of accountability, right? And we're forcing the so-called citizen journalism back into the pipeline of traditional publication at that point. It's a good solution for some situations. It may not be the only solution we want to ensure a free flow of information within a society, because it's back to a world of gatekeepers, and the gatekeepers are accountable for the information.
So just to be clear, you're not favorable on regulation?
Not right now, not until we know more. I mean, I think, I understand the need, the desire for it. I'm not convinced it doesn't create more problems than it solves. And so, for me, regulation of blogging probably is not the right way to respond to it. But I do see the problem that regulation is designed to solve. And I don't know, I don't have the wisdom to know how we balance these things out. Right? Great power comes great responsibility, right? That we're gaining power, and as a society, we have not yet figured out how to use that power in a way that's responsible. And that's the danger, right? And the immediate response to that danger is, let's get rid of freedom. Rather than how do we learn to live with freedom, how do we educate people to take responsibility, how do we embed a code of ethics in the practices of a society at large, and how do we build fact-checking mechanisms. And those fact-checking mechanisms have to work in both directions. Because we could talk about the 60 Minutes story that Dan Rather did about Bush's war record that turns out to have been based on fabricated documents, right? And who called them out on that? The bloggers did. So the bloggers often fact-check professional journalists. We need the professional journalists to fact-check the bloggers. But in the case of the Obama birth certificate stuff, for the longest time, American journalists were caught in this, well, we're going to report both sides of the story and not take a position. So they didn't fact-check the bloggers. They were shrugging and said, here's the story. Some bloggers think Obama wasn't born in this country. And the facts weren't served by that. You know, there were factual information that could correct that and respond to it. So the bloggers are holding journalists accountable, but journalists are reluctant to hold bloggers accountable. And I think the system might work best if there was lots of checks and balances, where the groups are, you know, and are really holding each other accountable and really taking ownership of the stories that are going on. But by and large, journalists use bloggers as an excuse to report things they'd love to report, and they don't have the sources for them, right? So rumors can be reported by journalists, you know, the sex life of politicians, juicy stuff, what we can say bloggers said, you know, this guy was having sex. Instead of saying, you know, what if we checked the bloggers and found out if they were right or not, and then challenge that in the news. We have an ombudsman who checks the newspaper in a lot of cases. What if we had an ombudsperson who checked the blogosphere and was engaged in dialogue about what's accountable, and creating some sense of accountability for this? And in my country, Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert may be the few people who hold anyone accountable for what they say. And they do what professional journalists don't tend to do, is go back to the record, dig out in the archive previous statements, read them against the present statement. That contextualizing is the work that journalists should be doing, but by and large, they're not doing in terms of creating a structure of accountability. So we need that professional accountability more than ever. But I don't think legislation is the way to get it. I think creating other structures that respond to the major debates of the time and that may dip into the blogosphere and say, here's a piece of misinformation. Trust the person with skepticism, not cynicism. Cynicism is I assume everyone is corrupt and lying. Skepticism is that I don't assume everyone is telling the truth, right? And that's a very different thing. It's like reading sources against each other, looking at as many different kinds of information as I can, try to figure out what makes the most sense. But yeah, I think skepticism, trained skepticism on the part of the public, is the only response to this kind of expanded news environment that we're describing here.
How do we do that? How do we educate the public to be skeptic about bloggers or any
Well,
information at all?
You know, there's a division of labor, right? And I, as an educator, have one function to play inside the classroom. And my colleagues in the journalism school do training programs for kids at high schools and in elementary schools that are designed to get them not to train to be journalists, but to train to be critics and aware of news and news literacy skills. But I think the news itself has key roles to play, and I think it has not done as much as it can to educate people about the nature of this environment. Not in a self-interested way, you know, don't read Wikipedia, it's full of misinformation, but in a way that's about how do we create an awareness of what citizens, the skills citizens need in order to process information. So in my country, there's a strong tradition of fact-checking political advertisements, right? That's something that's gone on for decades, and there are conflicting ideas about does that encourage skepticism or cynicism, you know, and there's different research on that. But you know, the political ad goes up, and many newspapers are checking all of the information in it and presenting to the public. This is true. This is partially true. You know, this is.
But for this new generation, the news brand or the strongest of the journalist name is important. You think?
I think so. I think it is. I think quality still rolls out, and I think that much of what gets circulated through social media are clips from relatively authoritative sources. You know, I think the brands of news still matter to young people, even if they choose not to read the New York Times. They listen to a story from the New York Times as it passes through Facebook and reaches them. And I think it has a different weight than a story from the National Enquirer. You know, from the tabloid press side of things. I think that there is some awareness of it. Maybe not for everyone. You know, there are a segment of the American population from New York Times equals liberal media. And that they're skeptical precisely because it comes through the New York Times, and they'd much rather read from some right-wing publication, much rather trust Fox News than the New York Times. That is very much part of a segment of the public, so we may not reach them in this way. But I think for a lot of people, there is an opportunity still to educate them about it. But if you take bloggers or liars as your starting point, then that's not going to work. If you take how do you read a piece of information critically, and how do we read, and how do we sort out fact from fiction in this environment, then that may be a role that journalists have to play, alongside librarians, alongside teachers, alongside a number of other people who have a role to play in the communication environment in that regard. In the book Spreadable Media, we lay out a variety of factors that we see in many cases of it. But the key insight I think we have is to think of media as a gift, right? That what's going on is people are giving media to each other as part of their ongoing social relationship. And the exchange of media is about strengthening social ties with each other. So if you understand it in that way, and you think about, all right, what makes a good gift says both communicates something about the person who's receiving it and about the person who gave it, right? The choice of the gift is an expression of minimally affection, the social reciprocity, but often conveys more. So if I give a kind of science kit to an elementary school kid, I'm communicating something about I hope for his future, who I'd like to see him become. That gift is understood in that way. So what often happens is people are taking commercially produced content and turning it into a gift that they give to someone else in order to strengthen their social relationships. Now, this is not unusual. When most gifts you've given probably in your lifetime, you bought at a store, right? You bought them in an economic transaction. You gave them in a social transaction. And the magic moment may be when you take the price tag off, right? You say, no longer what I paid for it, it's what it means in this friendship when I give you this thing. So once we go there, then we can say, all right, what do we give each other? We give each other laughter. We give each other love. We share our miseries with each other. We, talk about things that are urgent and important parts of our lives. So the more that media becomes a resource we can use to talk to each other about things that matter within whatever the social community is, the more likely it's going to be taken up and spread. So the more different communities that can have conversations around the content produced, the more people will see that content. And that's the logic to try to think about what is the connection people have? What does it allow people to say with this content?
Charlie bit my finger. How do you explain that?
No, I mean, it's hard to explain the scale that Charlie bit my finger got, but it's a kind of likable story about two kids. Everyone who's a parent seen it. The idea that you could trade this story and travel. At a certain point, it travels further because it's traveled so far already. People are trading and going, you wouldn't believe this many people watch this video, and then you pass it along to someone else. So there's an amplification effect as things start to travel, that they become news because they're traveling. But the initial probably there is something as simple as most people have kids or no kids, and this is very human, very real kind of story about how kids act, and not the kind of image of kids behaving toward each other that you get in commercials or most commercial entertainment. It's kind of raw and unedited footage of kids being kids.
And it's just, I think, that the same thing parents used to do in the past when they would say, Rosie, dance for your uncle, and in this sense it's not dancing for the uncle because it's becoming
bigger than the uncle,
a much bigger thing, but it's still showing off your kids. It's still showing off, how cute they are. Only it's done in a different medium, and therefore the scale becomes so much
Absolutely.
more huge.
It's, pull it down to very basic human behaviors, which is why I use the metaphor of the gift. We understand why we give things to people and what giving things to people means, and we understand that that's complex, involved with both economic relations and social relations. But by and large, once I get a gift, unless I'm a real louse, I don't say that gift's too cheap. You didn't spend enough money on me. I may think it, but I don't say it. The economic relations doesn't go away, but the social relationships dominates the minute it's a gift. And so as people who are creators of content, you have to think of I'm designing a gift that someone will give to someone else. So what would motivate me to give this news story to someone else as a gift? Because it has information they need in order to act on the world, because it expresses a new way of thinking about a problem they're involved with, because it makes them feel good about the world or reaffirms their beliefs about the world. These are the kinds of choices about what news stories get passed along, that they are things that connect to people's lives and connect to the communities that they're passing them through. I'll go back to the story of the blind librarian student of mine the blind need information. And they're not going to get it from a local paper. So in that case, information about issues affecting the visually impaired are a gift they can give to each other. Or a bad idea that what Invisible Children was advocating happens. Many experts on Africa think that it probably would result either not change anything or have more negative consequences than positive consequences. So what happened was there was a debate about what was the right thing to do, and a debate about what's right for Africa. And it's a debate that involves a significant number of African voices in the end. Because the video circulated to Uganda and other parts of Africa. Ugandan Prime Minister spoke out and made a video on YouTube that responded to it. Ugandan voices came into the conversation and were seen by Americans and Europeans about these issues. And that may be the biggest consequence here, is that it got those connections and those awarenesses, and to some degree changed the way Americans thought about Africa, insofar as those communications became part of the story. But its story at a certain point got swamped by the personal tragedy of Jason Russell having a nervous breakdown in a very public way, and the video that also circulated, not as far and as fast as the Coney video.
Who saw it here?
Was the naked and pounding on the ground outside the headquarters.
Only one.
Eu vi esse vídeo.
Do produtor ficar maluco na rua.
So the tragedy in some cases, and the problem was because this was social media, the video originally had been framed around him to people who knew him because he was reaching to his followers who had known and followed his stories for 8 or 9 years. They've always framed it as the personal story of Americans who encounter Africa and grow and change as a result of that experience. He becomes a role model for the young people. But once it's removed from the context where people knew him, it looked incredibly self-indulgent, on the one hand, and sort of more white guys from America talking about how we help Africa. And on the other, once he became discredited, the entire campaign got discredited. Whether or not, and he was discredited because of the emotional stress, something snapped in the emotional stress of just having this thing go so big and so fast with all of the pushback. But one of the critiques we've had of organizations like Invisible Children is they are very good at teaching people to spread messages and very bad at teaching people how to rebut or engage in debates around those messages. So the organization was largely caught off guard by the circulation, and when there was pushback, the members didn't know how to respond. They'd seen this video, they were moved by it, they passed it along, but the organization didn't give them enough other information beyond that they could use to defend their position or to advocate their position effectively. And that's, I think, one of the real lessons coming out of Invisible Children, is that it's not enough to teach people how to spread information if they can't defend the information they're spreading. And I think the groups we're studying through our project are all regrouping and trying to figure out how to do something about that as a problem. So, and some of it is it spread so fast, they were planning to put a lot of information on the website, and they threw the video out, and they were going to update the website, and they got caught on the crossfire, and so there never was anything there about the campaign until the last minute, and then the campaign couldn't move fast. So they had everyone's fantasies get maximum publicity. In this case, the publicity destroyed what they were trying to publicize. And there's a lot of lessons, I think, that organizations will have to take from that once the dust is settled on CUNY 2012.